Step by Jackson Brown. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. As we continue our discussion on the state of the economy, we're joined in Los Angeles by veteran journalist and Truthdig.com editor Robert Scheer. His book is out today. It's called The Great American Stickup: How Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats Enriched Wall Street While Mugging Main Street. Bob, welcome to Democracy Now! What is wrong with the economy today, and how did we get here?
Well, you know, you say a longtime journalist. I worked for the Los Angeles Times as a national reporter, and I covered these hearings in Washington when the Clinton administration in the 90s basically fulfilled the promise of the Reagan Revolution. Reagan was not able to reverse the sensible regulations of the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, designed to prevent us from getting into another depression. And those regulations, Glass-Steagall, which Feingold was against, was for keeping and against reversing, said that investment banks playing with supposedly rich people's money should not be allowed to merge with commercial banks that were using the deposits of people that were insured by the taxpayers, and that these were different activities. And Reagan could never pull off that kind of deregulation. In fact, because of the savings and loan scandal, at the end of his term, he actually had to sign off on increased financial regulation. But when Clinton came in, he brought in one of the big players on Wall Street, Robert Rubin, who had been head of Goldman Sachs, and basically turned to him and said, you know, what do I need to do to get Wall Street on my side? And they said reverse what they considered to be onerous financial regulation. And Clinton delivered on that. He brought in Rubin then to be his Treasury Secretary, who was followed by Lawrence Summers, who's now the top economics advisor in the Obama White House. And in addition to the Graham bill that reversed Glass-Steagall, he did something even more significant for our current crisis. He, after Summers had pushed it through, Congress signed off on the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. He was already a lame duck president. It was in the closing weeks of his administration. And this is the source of our whole problem, really, in terms of the housing meltdown, because we had these suspect derivatives that sensible people in the administration, like Brooksley Born, had warned against. No one knew what these toxic investments all about, the bundling of mortgages, which is what encouraged all of the wild subprime and Alt-A financing, because they were then going to be packaged together, made into securities, and then backed by credit default swaps, and all of this stuff that really didn't exist. It certainly didn't exist in Adam Smith's capitalism, but it didn't really exist even in Ronald Reagan's capitalism. This newfangled, these gimmicks that were developed and spiraled wildly out of control were made possible because of that Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which Clinton signed, and which said in Titles 3 and 4, no existing government regulation, no existing government regulatory body will be allowed to supervise these credit default swaps, these collateralized debt obligations that were there. And as a result, we had this wild run-up of irresponsible mortgage lending. The banks no longer did, as in the old days, worry about whether you could make your payments, whether there was value in the house, because they weren't going to hold that mortgage for 30 years like in the old days. They were going to sell it, you know. And that wild run-up of the market, I call it the Clinton bubble. I think his administration deserves or should be given the main responsibility. And that is at the source of our problem. And this has not gone away. This is why we're threatened with a possible another steep decline, or we're threatened with a decade of Japanese-type stagnation. And the reason is because we now, taxpayers, are holding, trillions of dollars of this stuff, these toxic investments. And as a result, housing right now is a terrible state of affairs. There are 11 million homeowners that are underwater. They owe more on their mortgages and their houses. That translates to about 50 million people living in houses that are now worth less than what they owe on them, and they're tempted to walk away from them. That's why we don't have any consumer demand. And it's not just the people who are in trouble with their own house, which is a tragic enough story, but even if somebody's made every payment, even if they own their own outright, if you foreclose a house or two in that neighborhood, it brings everyone else down. And all this stuff that Obama's been talking about really does not meet the problem. And the basic problem is, instead of throwing money at Wall Street, which is what Bush did and what Obama continued to do, you should have had a moratorium on housing foreclosures. You should have said, okay, Wall Street, we'll help you, but you have now going to be forced through bankruptcy courts, new rules we're going to put in place to adjust people's mortgages so they can stay in their home. And all this malarkey about we'll do more infrastructure, you know, and so they always do that. We'll spend $50 billion on this, what he said in Wisconsin. What is that, $50 billion? It's chump change compared to, say, the $300 billion of toxic investments by one group, Robert Rubin's bank, Citigroup. He went after he left the administration to be a top big shot at Citigroup, made possible by the reversal of Glass-Steagall, and you know, $300 billion. So compare that to the $50 billion they're going to do for infrastructure for the whole nation. And I think the sad thing about Obama, you know, obviously I supported him. I wrote columns thinking he was going to be great. Enormous disappointment. No one can explain to me. I haven't seen a satisfactory explanation. But in my book, I reprint the speech that Obama gave in the spring of '08 when he was a candidate. And it came 3 months after Robert Rubin had given a speech at Cooper Union saying we had no financial problem, we had no crisis. 3 months later, Obama at that same Cooper Union said, you know, this is all due to reversal of Glass-Steagall, all due to reckless, radical deregulation. He spelled it out, and then, you know, mysteriously, maybe not so mysteriously when you think that Wall Street became his biggest, financial community became his biggest campaign contributor. He turned to the disciples of Robert Rubin, the Lawrence Summers, Timothy Geithner, the very people that had, with Rubin, created this mess, and said, okay, you guys, fix it all. And they haven't fixed it. They've taken care of Wall Street, and as my subtitle in my book said, they mugged Main Street.
We're talking to Robert Scheer. Robert, you said this is what President Obama should have done, for example, a moratorium on all bankruptcies. What should he do now? Why should have? What could he do starting today?
Oh, immediately he should push for the bankruptcy courts to have the power to force the banks to readjust these mortgages. You know, we picked up their bad paper. Why don't they help people now who are stuck? You know, the basic idea of the New Deal was that these were not innocent victims of Wall Street scams. So we have, this is why you have all this anger in the Tea Party and everything else. It's very legitimate. I'm not one of the, and by the way, you mentioned Feingold, and I would be a tragedy to lose Feingold. If there's one person in the United States Congress that has called this correctly, that has stood up for the interest of ordinary people, it's Russ Feingold. I mean, I can't think, you know, maybe Bernie Sanders, but Russ Feingold has been at it longer in the Senate. And I mean, he just has been right on this stuff from day one. And the idea that rage about what's happened to the economy is now going to take its toll on him, the one guy one of the few who got it right, is really frightening. But that's what happens when you have an economic breakdown. We saw it in Germany, for God's sake. You know, you look, the demagogues scapegoat all the people, you know, the scapegoat immigrants. And what you have now is a lot of money from the big banks and everyone else going into lunatics the campaign of lunatics. But why? Because, oh, get government off our back, you know, big government, ignoring the fact that, you know, this government did not get big and the debt did not rise because we're trying to help firemen or school teachers keep